Don't vote. And no, right off the bat, this is not a satire video. I'm earnestly telling you that it may not be in your best interest to vote this election cycle. I'm mostly talking to conservatives and right-wingers here, but know that this could apply to both sides. But why should we abstain from voting? Many of you will already be thinking of one of a number of canned responses to what I've said so far in this video. Voting is your civic duty. We have to vote for the lesser of two evils. If you don't vote, then you can't complain about who gets elected and so on and so forth. But these and many others fail to address what is the key issue here, which is that to vote for a candidate is to assent to their platform, to signal to those running their campaign that you approve of the messaging that they have put out.
Our message to gay Americans tonight is this. You're free to marry who you want, if you want, without the government standing in your way.
And I think that, frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if me and Trump won just the normal gay guy vote. Because, sure, again, they just wanted to be left the hell alone.
But what should you do if, like so many other conservatives, you see the Republican Party shifting ever further away from real conservative values? It's not at all an original thought to say that modern-day conservatives are the liberals of 10 years ago, and for good reason. What about if you're an anti-war conservative? Trump has repeatedly signaled his undying support for Israel at a time when tensions are close to boiling over in the region. If you oppose these nouveau conservative values, then you can feel stuck in this ever downward trend when it comes to voting. Every election, you're presented with two candidates, both of which march ever onwards towards more and more liberalism. Now, if you examine each election by itself, without regard to larger and slower trends in politics, the choice will always be obvious. If you're a conservative, then the Republican Party is always going to align more closely with your values than will the Democratic one. So you will feel obligated to put the Republican in power, if for nothing else than to avoid putting the Democrat in power. You may even dislike the Republican candidate or platform, but you will inevitably come to the conclusion that it would be foolish not to vote for the lesser of two evils. The loop will then come to a close when in 4 to 8 years, when things have gotten even more woke, you're forced to choose another Republican candidate, more liberal than the last, but still not nearly as liberal as the new Democratic candidate. I'll be arguing in this video that there necessarily comes a time when continually choosing the lesser of two evils is not a viable strategy. That if we want to influence the course of conservative politics in the US via that small power afforded to us by the vote, that we need to sometimes consider withholding that vote rather than letting these parties take it for granted. I'll continue fleshing out this idea later in the video, but first we should reflect a little bit on just how ineffective voting is in the first place. And know that this section isn't meant to demotivate listeners or to dissuade them from taking political action. Rather, it's meant to motivate us towards action, only by other more effective and admittedly more difficult means than voting. Because if we are talking about voting, it affords you very little power. Specifically in the presidential election, which is, let's face it, the one that people spend most of their time talking about, if you're outside of a swing state, your vote pretty much right off the bat does not count. Beyond this, we can even consider swing counties, sections of those swing states which receive the majority of campaign attention. So simply put, an incredibly small percentage of the votes even count. Despite 155 million votes being cast for president in 2020, 21,461 votes exactly could have changed the outcome and seen a Trump victory. For those of us outside of swing states, one of the main reasons people even bother voting is as an act of self-expression. People want to identify with a certain party or candidates, policies, or personality, and voting helps them feel like they're part of the team. For the large number of people that vote this way, what was supposed to be this sacred civic duty has become little more than supporting a sports team. The Red Sox don't change their behavior whether you show up to Fenway or not, but the Red Sox fan may enjoy that he's reinforcing his connection to Boston or to his family, who is also full of Red Sox fans. This voting as a means of self-expression probably explains most of the hundreds of thousands of votes that third-party candidates get every year. But even if you are one of the few in swing states whose vote really counts, what is your one, we'll assume, well-educated vote against the vote of everybody else showing up on election day? Now, this is probably something you should just be able to intuit, but if you need some help understanding, let's look at the 2019 Annenberg Constitution Day Civic Survey. According to that survey, only 39% of voters polled could identify all three branches of government. 47% named only one branch or none at all, meaning it is guaranteed that they did not know at least one of the branches they were electing people for. According to the same survey, when asked, what does it mean if the US Supreme Court rules 5-4 on a case, 41% of people did not choose the correct multiple choice response of, the decision is the law and needs to be followed. This one isn't even a simple lack of knowledge, but a lack of basic problem-solving skills. And lastly, only 55% knew that the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives at the time, a result which is hardly better than chance. And obviously I could go on like this for a while. If you want to get more black-pilled on voting, check out that Annenberg website. I will link it in the description. The fact of the matter is people are simply not going to be able to educate themselves when their sources of information, if anything, are the mainstream media or maybe some alternative media figures who are in reality campaign spokespeople for their respective parties. With these sources, there is very little chance of coming to an unbiased or nuanced opinion on key political issues. Beyond this, it's questionable if your average person, even if given theoretically high quality and unbiased reporting, could come to an informed decision on what is best for the country if they lack even a basic philosophical understanding of politics. If you haven't spent any time considering what a government ought to be, and more broadly, what qualities of government align with the good, then how can you be expected to make the complicated and roundabout decision of picking an elector who will ultimately benefit the country? Now, for what it's worth, I do think that most people, those in the know anyhow, do understand what I've said so far. Yes, the odds of your vote technically mattering are close to zero. And yes, most people are low information voters. But perhaps we should still vote out of a sense of civic duty. The problem with this argument is that voting is of course not the only way you can fulfill your civic duty. In fact, given its ineffectiveness as demonstrated above, it may be one of the worst ways to fulfill said civic duty, while simultaneously presenting the moral hazard of allowing people to feel they have achieved said duty via a passive and largely worthless vote. You could do practically anything else political. Volunteer, work in government, attend a protest, heck, make a YouTube channel if you want, and it would be a far greater fulfillment of your civic duty than voting. And all of these things can be done more than one day every 2 years. But if the general pointlessness of voting doesn't encourage you to stay home on election day, if you still hold on to this vanishingly small amount of power that your vote affords you and you value it dearly, then at the very least you ought to spend some time in serious consideration about how to best employ this power of yours. Which brings us back to what we talked about at the start of this video. Is it legitimate to withhold your vote? Let's start by noting that the least effective way to make your voice heard by a campaign is to vote for them, to effectively endorse all of their policies. The campaigns will naturally take a large percentage of voters turning out from a certain demographic or region as a sign that they don't need to change anything in order to get their votes. And again, it's not enough to merely complain about those specific policies with which you disagree and then give that party your vote anyways because you want to vote for the lesser of two evils. The only thing which will significantly move the needle is to hit them where it hurts. And this is more relevant than ever in modern American elections, which are increasingly won by turning out one's base to vote rather than appealing to moderates. In years past, it was a good general strategy for candidates to engage in a so-called race to the middle, to appeal to swing voters, people who reliably will vote for different parties election to election. But over the years, perhaps because of increased political polarization, increased exposure to information, or any number of other factors, the number of these persuadable or undecided voters going into the selection is at an all-time low. According to American National Election Surveys, between 1948 and 2004, an average of 17% of voters made their ultimate decision for who they would elect in the last 2 weeks before Election Day. That number shrank to just 6% in 2020, and we seem to be even more polarized going into this election. According to Emerson College polling, as of a whole 2 months ago on September 5th, 2024, only 3% of voters nationally considered themselves undecided. And that number shrank to only 1% by October 24th. Even in so-called swing states, which one might think would have a larger number of persuadable voters, we see these same record low numbers, with, for example, Michigan at 2% undecided and Pennsylvania at 3%. And while polls may be good at determining sentiment, they're not very good at determining whether or not that respondent will actually show up to vote on Election Day, which is another reason motivation is the most important factor. It's the largest unknown. This is why, especially in today's political climate, withholding your vote can be immensely powerful. The campaigns know that getting you out to vote, you who clearly falls on one of the two sides of the political aisle, is their win condition. So your decision on Election Day is not actually between two candidates. Almost everybody, including I suspect most of those people who claim to be undecided, knows which side they prefer. Now, I don't think I've technically discussed my political leanings on this channel before. While women were irrational and not to be trusted, obviously, if you believe in democracy for some reason, what will be the nature of the upcoming American dictatorship? 42% of the political guests on Joe Rogan's podcast are Jewish. But unsurprisingly, I would consider myself to be more on the conservative side of the aisle. So voting for Kamala Harris is not in the cards for me. Instead, my decision, and I think many of yours, is to choose whether or not I award the party which represents our side of politics with my vote, which is me de facto assenting to their policies and direction, or whether I abstain from voting in an attempt to signal that I do not support the Republicans' take on conservatism and that I want their direction to change. By way of metaphor, modern elections are unique in that they are not a decision between 1 or 0, Republican or Democrat. Rather, they're a decision between 1 and null, with 0 being pretty much unconscionable. That brings us to this election in particular and Trump. As a conservative, as anyone under the broad flag of right-wing or traditionalist, do you feel that the direction Trump is taking is correct? And to know that going forward, this is not me attacking Trump. As should be clear, I agree with many more of his policies than Kamala's. Rather, it's to get you to consider whether or not we've reached that point where voting for the lesser of two evils will ultimately do more harm than good. We should of course quickly comment on abortion. Trump's stance on abortion is at best controversial. While certainly more pro-life than Harris, Trump has flip-flopped on the issue, and in my opinion, likely only discusses it because it is a critical issue. If you are a Catholic though, U.S. Catholic bishops as recent as late 2023 have re-emphasized abortion as a, quote, preeminent priority for Catholic voters. So this election, you have to decide if Trump's sort of liberal pro-life stance on abortion is something which you can see ultimately leading the country towards something resembling your views on the issue. Next, migration. While talking tough on the border,
and we will stop illegal immigration once and for all. We will stop criminals from coming into our country. We will not be invaded. We will not be occupied. We will not be overrun. We will not be conquered. We will be a free and proud nation once again.
Trump actually got very little done on the issue. Some people will try to claim that the number of green cards issued was lower under Trump than in years past. While this is technically true, if we ignore the complete cessation of new green card issuance under the pandemic lockdowns, then the number of green cards issued was virtually unchanged from the previous administration. And as for his next term, while on the campaign trail, Trump has strongly and repeatedly endorsed the idea of increased legal migration.
I want people to come into our country in the largest numbers ever, but they have to come in legally. And again, we want people to come into our country. We all want that. We need that. But you know what? We want them to come in legally. They're going to come in legally and love for our country. First, we're going to close that border, and people are going to come in. You want people to come in. We need people to come in. People are going to come into our country legally.
As for illegal migration, I think it's fair to question his track record here as well. Trump famously said he would build a wall and even make Mexico pay for it via a tax on remittances. During his term, some walling was built. 458 miles of walling was constructed, but 373 of those miles simply replaced existing walling, with 85 miles in total constituting new border wall construction. While this isn't a bad start, this means that only roughly 36% of the 2,000-mile Mexico-US border is covered. Now, to be sure, Trump faced strong resistance when trying to build this wall, but still, to a certain extent, we have to judge a tree by its fruits. Regarding those already in the country illegally, the 2024 Republican campaign pushed the message of mass deportations now very hard, especially at the RNC. Yet when asked about this policy in interviews, Trump and Vance give only very lackluster responses, only mentioning how they're going to focus on deporting illegal immigrants who commit violent crimes.
What do we do with them? I think the first thing that we do is we start with the criminal migrants. About 1 million of those people have committed some form of crime in addition to crossing the border illegally. I think you start with deportations on those folks.
Additionally, if we look at Trump's first term, we see that throughout, arrests by ICE and removals by both ICE and CBP were down significantly as compared to even Obama's second term. And most concerning to me by far is Trump's undying support for Israel and her wars.
We're here tonight because we believe that this vicious outbreak of militant and anti-Semitism is very militant, must be given no quarter, no safe harbor, no place in a civilized society. Just last week, Kamala even said she would consider imposing a full arms embargo against Israel. Major embargo, too. Just a complete embargo. Israel to get nothing. When I'm back in the Oval Office, I will support Israel's right to win its war on terror. They have to have a right to win the war. When I'm president, the United States will once again stand shoulder to shoulder with the state of Israel. I will support Israel's right to win its war on terror. We must stand with our friend and partner, the state of Israel. We will, strongly. And we're going to make Israel great again, and we're going to make America great again. We're going to make them both great again.
Trump's vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, has also signaled his support for Israel and his willingness to fight Iran on behalf of Israel.
But also Iran, Sean. A lot of people recognize that we need to do something with Iran, but not these weak little bombing runs. If you're going to punch the Iranians, you punch them hard, and that's what he did when he took out Soleimani.
Well, we can't say for certain why Trump feels so strongly about supporting Israel. Perhaps he has considered the issue deeply and simply determined that they're in the right. This author is a little bit skeptical that it doesn't have something to do with the makeup of his campaign donors, of which 30% of the top 20 are ethnically Jewish. This genuinely is not to suggest something nefarious. Rather, it's a simple fact which suggests a reasonable hypothesis as to why Trump supports Israeli causes so strongly. If a majority of his donors were black, I would expect him to focus much more on black issues and so on. People simply don't give hundreds of millions of dollars to political parties out of the goodness of their hearts. As an aside, this figure for Jewish representation among campaign donors is actually much higher in the case of Democrats. I have previously examined donor information for 2022 campaigns, and in that year, 57.1% of the top 49 donors to the Democratic Party were ethnically Jewish. Take that for what you will. Now, to conclude, I know that a lot of people watching this, if they bothered to watch this far, will have had the message of this video completely wash over them, and they'll just reply in the comments something like, "But Harris is so much worse." And again, from my political viewpoint, I of course agree. For these people, let me briefly restate my thesis. I'm simply arguing that in the long term, it is necessarily a losing prospect for conservatives to continue to vote for the Republican Party when they have proven themselves incapable of conserving anything for more than 10 years. Everyone is aware that the Republican Party of today is an extremely liberal party, and growing more so every day. If you agree with me that this direction is not good and will ultimately lead the country to a bad place, then at some point we must necessarily withhold the vote. The only question that remains is whether or not that time is now, or we want to wait for things to get worse. And I want to end this video by again saying that whether or not you agree with me on the ineffectiveness of voting, we should all agree that it cannot be our only form of political engagement. In the best case scenario, it is extremely passive when compared to volunteering, helping with campaigns, or engaging in whatever other legitimate form of political action you can think of. Even reading a book by yourself will undoubtedly have a much larger political impact than a single vote in your deep red or deep blue state. If you'd like to engage in political life, then by all means go and vote. But maybe at the same time, pick up a copy of the Federalist Papers. Or, memes aside, start with the Greeks. Even a cursory reading of Plato will put you miles ahead of your peers who only passively consume these lame political podcasts. In any case, regardless of what you do this election day, I just want to say thank you all for watching and have a lovely day.